And yet you'll have
on this plan is going to
I just thought
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, like to settle down, please. A couple of parish notices before we start. The Christmas party is taking place next Saturday, the 6th. A Great Gatsby theme, among the whisperings and the champagne. Our games will, of course, be in the best possible taste, so we have a shoot Gatsby into the swimming pool and run Myrtle down with the jalopy. Fun for all the family. The next NSC meeting, we're actually combining the club night with our Christmas moot. That will be here on the December the 19th, the Friday. And the following club night is the 28th of January, where Francis Mitchell will talk about a lobster down under, Bob's World Tour 2025, aka Carrying Up the Colonies.
He's on the table somewhere by you, I think.
And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. So very pleased to welcome Denholm Knowles, who will talk on Freaks of the Wireless. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind invite and having me here to speak today. I'm going to talk to you about the first wireless hack that occurred in 1902. But it's not just about the hack, it's about the spectacular conflict and the war of words that happened between Marconi, the inventor of wireless telegraphy, and a famous magician by the name of Nevil Maskelyne. So, in 1903, Marconi and John Ambrose Fleming were putting on a demonstration. And this was a demonstration of a secure way to send wireless messages. And it was a very public affair at the Royal Institution. The eyes of the world were on it. And it got hacked. And lots of pithy phrases were sent into the auditorium. There was big embarrassment all round. And the hacker turned out to be a magician. But we'll just start with a brief definition. I appreciate I've spoken to some of you, and you seem quite technologically inclined. So,
as evidenced by all the more coal.
So we'll just define a hack as the deliberate misuse of a system to subvert its intended purpose. So if we have a hack, we have to have a hacker. And our hacker is Mr. Nevil Maskelyne. And in his time, he was a world-famous magician. So he came into magic through his father, John Nevil Maskelyne. So his father was known as J.N. His full name was also John Nevil Maskelyne. And he had a son called John Nevil Maskelyne.
Christmas must have been fun.
Yes, so to differentiate, J.M. was the father, Nevil was the son. And they operated out of the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. And this was known as England's home of mystery. And how J.N. came into magic was through debunking spiritualists. So as the story goes, there was the Davenport brothers who were demonstrating a spiritual cabinet where spirits would make things fly around the cabinet. And J.N. stands up and he goes, I will show you how this is done. I will come back in a couple of months' time. And he comes back and does it much better than the spiritualists and debunks them. And then he gets into illusions that way. And as part of developing these tricks, they became quite inventive. And they invented a load of illusions and contraptions that they would use at the Egyptian Hall. And magicians from all around the world would come and see how they do it there and then replicate it out. So one of the things JN did, or he was actually the founder of the Magic Circle, which still exists to this day. And Nevil was the first editor of the Magic Circular, which was their first kind of publication. And I presume he came up with the motto, not apt to disclose secrets, but in this kind of Latin form. And Nevil wrote about magic, and he got quite technical into the details about it and that sort of stuff. And one of the most famous illusions he came up with was the illusion of levitation. Now, I understand subsequently it's really taken off.
Well done.
So,
Is that Hawkwind album?
so they had been using various forms of levitation since about the 1870s, but the 1901 show of the In Trance Fakir was where Neville's gooseneck contraption was the one that was replicated and really became famous. But as they would work in the workshop at the Egyptian Hall and invent these contraptions and things like this, Neville spoke about the monotony of a magician's life. So he found the whole affair a little bit boring. So he'd go and invent other stuff. And one of his inventions, which was quite interesting, was the Maskelyne typewriter. So this was the first differential space typewriter that was sold in the UK. Now, he came up with this, they sold the patents, and it was set up as kind of a business. Ultimately, it didn't fail, so if you see one of those, it's probably worth quite a lot of money. By all accounts, it's a very nice typewriter.
There's like proportional spacing of the characters.
Yes, that's correct. So it's kind of the first of its kind in that respect. So as much as it made the text nice to read on the page, there's a bit of a pain if you need to go back and correct anything. So, but at the Egyptian Hall, they also had lots of projections and kind of cameras and things like that. So he came up with his own designs for projectors and things of that nature that were used within the show. There was another invention as well. So if you've ever had a ticket pop out of the counter, let's say a cinema, that was something that was invented by JN. They invented machines of bus tickets and all sorts of stuff like that. They were quite prolific in that sense. And one of the more interesting ones is the the paid toilet lock. So this is likely where the phrase "spend a penny" comes from. So you might say Neville was born to take the piss. Sorry, I'm here for a while, so. But Neville and JN shared quite a nice social network, and one of their acquaintances was John Mackenzie Bacon, who was into hot air ballooning and astronomy. Now, Neville was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Association, and in 1900 they went on an expedition to North Carolina. And they went on this expedition to film an eclipse. So the story goes, Neville went over on a boat to America, but when he turned up there, he checked his gear, and his camera lens was missing. It hadn't been shipped. So he was against the clock to build a camera lens for his camera so he could film the eclipse, which he was able to do. And Bacon noted that he had the genius of a Maskelyne. And he was able to film the oldest known footage of an astronomical event. So this is the oldest film of anything astronomical there is. It was recently remastered in 4K. That's not a joke. That's actually a fact. But yeah, his involvement with John Mackenzie Bacon carried on in the ballooning space. And he followed on with experimentations with hot air ballooning, and one of the things he did was demonstrate a wireless system. So they put a receiver up in the balloon and they transmitted from the surface to the receiver. So it's probably the first land-to-air transmission. But this was an invention of Neville's own creation. So people were starting to emerge and patent their own wireless devices. But Neville's was sufficiently unique from Marconi's, which meant he had his own creation. And this got the attention of onlookers who were from the military and things like that. So it garnered quite a lot of interest. And one of those of note was Lord Kelvin, who was big in cable telegraphy. And he kind of progressed from there in the wireless space. So that's a patent of his own device, which was distinct from Marconi's. But it's worth just, I suppose, talking about Marconi and how he emerged through into kind of the wireless battle arena, I guess. So Marconi was Italian-Irish descent. He grew up in Italy, and he was known for being quite a shy and introvert kind of chap when he grew up. He was well educated, and there was always something, as is said, that was quite commanding about his personality, so the people around him followed him. He sort of had a natural leadership to him. But kind of at the age of 20, he had read an obituary of Heinrich Hertz, who had experimentally proved the existence of wireless waves. And Hertz said that I do not think that wireless waves I have discovered will have any practical application. Now, this was actually a common view of the scientists at the time. They were discovering this stuff and they just didn't really think it would go anywhere. But Marconi certainly saw the potential in this. So within a year, he had built and successfully tested his own wireless system. Now, this was all done at his home, you know, his sort of testing on the kind of kitchen table and all that sort of stuff, building his own stuff in the kitchen and all that sort of thing. But in 1896, he comes to England to demonstrate this system. So he arrives in England, and he arrives by boat, and he's promptly met by customs, and he has this black box with him, which is his wireless invention. Now, customs being customs haven't changed a great deal, so they took his box apart and ruined it. So he's met by his cousin, who is it's Henry Jameson, and he's wealthy because his family sells whiskey, and he then funds Marconi to start patent filing for his invention in the UK. So during this time, Marconi then kind of hooks up with the post office and starts experimenting with them, and a year later he decides to go it alone. So effectively he resigns from the post office. And Marconi's patent is granted and he sets up his first signal station. Now, what he does is he starts taking all the best engineers from the post office, which leaves him into a bit of bother with the post office later down the line. So, within the following year, he receives his first shilling. So this is the first paid wireless transmission. And it's Lord Kelvin who paid for that. And he was the one who saw the interest in Nevil Maskelyne's system. And by 1899, he sent the first wireless transmission across the channel. And he hires John Ambrose Fleming as his scientific advisor, because he's a practitioner. He needs a true scientist to represent his interests in kind of the scientific arena and give him credibility. But also, he goes to the America's Cup. So what he does is set up his wireless equipment on a boat and start sending updates about the race back to shore. Now, you can imagine back in this time, people were limited to just kind of looking with binoculars. So it's a bit of a problem if you're trying to track a boat race. But it's an interesting conflict that brews, and it's not just about the moustaches. So here we have Sir Thomas Lipton of the tea fame, and he's contending J.P. Morgan to win the America's Cup and bring it back to Britain. He loses in quite spectacular fashion, but he would try again. But also, Marconi sending this, depending how you categorise it, is probably the first sports broadcast. But at this point, Marconi has set up his company and his infrastructure, and he's secured the protection on his intellectual property, and he's moving everything forward. So wireless systems at this time constituted from four kind of main things. So you had a transmitter, a receiver, a Morse key, and a printer. So they were quite basic and resembled lab equipment, essentially. But that meant if you had the knowledge, it was accessible, which meant people like Nevil Maskelyne could kind of enter and contend. Now, Nevil, following on from his success at the wireless balloon demonstration, starts working with Colonel Hosier, who is the secretary of Lloyd's. Now, it's not Lloyd's Bank, this is Lloyd's, the marine insurance company. And what they had was a network of signal, sort of flag semaphore stations all around coasts around the world. Now, it was in their interest that boats didn't sink, otherwise they'd have to pay out. So they started an experiment to try and replace the flag semaphore stuff with wireless transmissions. Now, they approach Marconi and try and sell Nevil's invention to him with a license for the Lloyd's stations. Marconi's not interested in Nevil's invention, he's only interested in the Lloyd's license. So Colonel Hosier cuts him out the deal and proceeds with that. And this is the start of the conflict. And what this does is really galvanise Marconi as having the technology, the infrastructure, and now the reach to really become kind of the dominant force in wireless telegraphy. So after Marconi secures the deal, he goes back to the next America's Cup, so 1901. So we have Sir Thomas Lipton contending against J.P. Morgan again. So in the first race, Lipton's boat was called Shamrock. In this race, he entered a new boat. Any guesses on the name?
Shamrock 2.
Bingo. So,
Solid name.
yeah. You wait till you hear what the third one is.
Shamrock free.
Spoiler.
But needless to say, Sir Thomas Lipton is absolutely beaten on this one again. But he had a little bit of challenges when he was testing Shamrock too. So he took it out on the Solent, but he invited King Edward VII out for a little bit of a jolly with him. Now, there is a nice little story there. So the mast fell off the Shamrock too, while King Edward was just sat at the top of the stairs, chuffing away on a cigar. So, but Marconi wasn't alone doing the wireless transmissions in the 1901 America's Cup. He had a contender, which was Lee DeForest. So he was essentially kind of an American Marconi, but he was always a step behind him. But the idea is that they would transmit updates on the race to respective news organisations. Now, the radios at this time weren't tuned, so they broadcast on quite a wide frequency. Now, what this meant is if they broadcast at the same time, they would overlap each other and it wouldn't work. So to get around this, they devised a timeshare scheme. And that went just about as well as you might expect it to. So they completely jammed each other, no one was able to transmit anything, and the whole thing was a bit of a failure. So Lee de Forest, frustrated by this failure, smashes his radio up and throws it off the side of the ship. There's something to be said about proportionate responses here. But it really highlighted that the lack of tuning was a practical problem for the wireless systems of this time. And this is something that needed to be resolved. Marconi would propose a solution, but we'll get to that in a minute. So after this America's Cup, Marconi decides he's going to do the first transatlantic transmission. Now, the conventional wisdom at the time said this wasn't possible because of the curvature of the Earth, and the wireless waves would just go straight off into space. But Marconi thought different, and he was able to show it. So he does this in secret, and the reason he does it in secret is because he doesn't actually hold a transmissions license in Canada where it would be received. So if he publicised it, he had the threat of litigation hanging over him. So this was only known to a few engineers. It was done, and then it's published. And it's heralded as success by the press, but not everyone was quite so impressed. So you had the traditional cable telegraphy companies, so these would be the ones laying big transatlantic cables and stuff like that so they could transmit messages all over the world. Now they had significantly invested in the infrastructure to do this, because you can imagine laying big cables underwater is pretty expensive. So wireless became quite a threat to them. So because there was no independent verification, it was just Marconi's word standing up against conventional wisdom. They thought it was telling a little bit of porky pie there. So they started deriding him publicly, but this kind of taught Marconi a lesson that really he needed to have independent verification of his experiments. But Marconi is so sure of his system, and he devises a system to get rid of the mutual interference and make sure that the messages are protected. And he calls this system syntony. Now this is a term that was invented because resonance was already taken. But he issues a challenge, which today we would call a bug bounty. So he's put out a statement saying, I have this system, if you can break it, I will pay you money. So he does this kind of the annual general meeting of his company, and he puts the challenge out. Now, one of the things he does with this challenge is he makes the terms of the challenge quite prohibitive to actually completing it. So he uses this as kind of a stick to whack people with, but someone would turn that around later. So also the fee he offered for being able to break his wireless was £100, which might be a round or two in London these days. But inflation adjusted, that's about £10,000. So Marconi needs to demonstrate his system and the tuning of his apparatus. So he embarks on a cruise using the Italian royal yacht, and that's called the Carlo Alberto. Now the Carlo Alberto happened to be in England for the coronation of King George VII, and it became available to him because the king was taken ill with appendicitis, so the boat was knocking around, not doing too much. So they retrofitted the boat with quite a lot of wires and stuff so they could send signals. And what they wanted to show is they could send secure messages from Marconi's station in Poldhu in Cornwall to the boat. So Marconi's flagship station in Poldhu, they also called them thunder factories because the amount of electricity needed to pump through them, and that's part of the reason why he hired John Ambrose Fleming, because of the power demands. And it just like give a big old rumble. So Marconi embarks on a trip to Russia, where he is going to give a demonstration to King Emmanuel III of Italy, who owns the boat, and Tsar Nicholas II. So part of this is giving the legitimacy to his experiments. He's got burn, but now he's involving other people to make sure he can't be challenged on his claims. So when he actually did the demonstration, he realised that during the day, sort of solar interference meant that actually the transmissions from Poldhu to Russia wouldn't work. They would only work at night. They hadn't resolved that problem. So Marconi's mate, when they did the demonstration, was sat at the back of the ship. Tsar Nicholas II rumbled them. So then they called out the guy from the back of the ship. It was all congratulated. It was all very cordial. But there was a second part to this cruise. But Nevil would be listening this time. So he had been hired by the Eastern Telegraph Company to come and do his own wireless experiments because the ships laying the cable still needed to communicate. So they had an interest in wireless technology, so they were testing Nevil's system on the ships there. Now, they were based in Porthcurno, which is kind of the main point where international cables come into England, and still to this day a lot of them do. But it's about 18 miles away from Poldhu. So Marconi goes down to the Mediterranean. I'm not sure that's actually an accurate picture of the boat, but and he's going to send a transmission to King Edward VII, then King Emmanuel III, again to prove his system. But Nevil had started picking up his messages already. So this is like kind of things like weather reports and just general updates and things like that. So the telegrams that were sent and the demonstration achieved the desired outcome for Marconi, at least in the short term. So it showed that his system of protected messages did work. And I published a big report about it, and it was all very kind of well received. And till the next week, when Nevil responded and published his own messages, he was able to intercept them. And effectively, he had met Marconi's challenge. And he was also able to demonstrate this by publishing messages that Marconi hadn't published. So he'd intercepted messages that Marconi hadn't said he'd sent, but there were definitely ones he had sent. So it's an interesting thing. Another thing happens. So during the messages between Poldhu and Marconi being in the Mediterranean, Poldhu got wise to someone listening. So they tried to send a second signal to mask what was being transmitted. And that was at a shorter power to try and limit the range of it. But it's still getting through to the Mediterranean. So Nevil was able to identify that there were two messages and decode them. So this qualifies as the first wireless hack because they had applied two levels of protection to try and protect the sensitivity of the message. And this is what he published, and this was his proof. Now, Marconi didn't know that Poldhu was sending a second message. And he was recovering from influenza, assumed that the Morse operator in Poldhu didn't know the Morse code, and started smashing up his equipment on the boat. So Marconi's mate has to stop him, they reassemble the equipment, and then they start receiving the messages, and they're able to send out the historic messages to the kings. But this leads to a curious affair, because there was quite a heated exchange afterwards, some quite spicy words in the newspapers and the journals of the time. But Marconi goes to repeat the transatlantic transmission, but learning his mistake, he involves Teddy Roosevelt and King Edward again. So Teddy sends a message across to Edward, and it's all happy days. But Marconi gets interviewed about this. And in this interview, he acknowledges that the messages that were sent in 1902 were tapped. But he denies that he tried to protect them. This brings Nevil back into the frame. And he asks for an apology. Because they've made quite a slight against his reputation. They effectively said he was lying. But Marconi doesn't respond to this. So Nevil issues his own challenge. So Nevil actually says that he did this, but it wasn't going to be anyone else, to be fair. It reads like a satire of Marconi's bug bounty. It has ridiculously stringent terms, conditions that are just impractical to meet. And effectively, by issuing this challenge, he's throwing back the accusation of being a liar and a forger back at Marconi. And he also does this under the name of Vindex, which I think is Latin for avenger or something along those lines. But then things get a little bit quiet until Marconi goes to do his demonstration at the Royal Institution. So Marconi keeps asserting his claim that his messages can't be tapped, and he can tune it so no one can read them. So the events would play out like this. So Marconi is down in Cornwall, and he's going to be transmitting to one of his stations in Chelmsford, which will relay the messages to the Royal Institution in London. Now, the Royal Institution couldn't receive them directly. They stuffed a yacht mast on the top of the building, but that just wasn't big enough to receive the messages. So, in London, John Ambrose Fleming would receive the messages and read them out live to the auditorium. Nevil had to do his homework on this one. So, he sent his accomplices to inspect the physical site, the Royal Institution. He established what would happen and when it would happen. And this would become important in how he achieves his hack. And he had a clearly stated objective that he wanted to do. But one of the things was he knew that they could hide any interference or any interception by just not telling the audience. So he had to calibrate a message that would piss them off so much they'd have to disclose it. So he also arranged for monitoring of what Poultry were doing by Porthcurno, where he'd worked previously. And he sent one of his stooges to witness in person. Now, an interesting little thing is the Royal Institution was about 300 metres down the road from the Egyptian Hall. So Nevil did this from the roof of the Egyptian Hall. You could probably see people coming and going towards the Royal Institution. And the day would kind of play out like this. So there'd be some backwards and forwards between the Royal Institution and Poultry. They would exchange some messages, and they're all kind of very nice and friendly and stuff like that. But during the presentation, which started at 5 o'clock, that's when they'd start reading out the messages. Now, because Nevil knew the sequence of events, he timed his message to be intercepted at a point when he knew Poultry weren't transmitting. And he sent the word rats over and over and over again. Now, he says he sent this because he's heard university professors use it as a term of frustration. things like that. But yeah, so at 5 minutes before the presentation's starting to beginning to wrap up, the Morse printer goes mad and starts printing out all these messages. And it's not just rats. It starts off with rats. And then he goes on to Shakespeare. So, one thing about Nevil and his exchanges with Fleming and Marconi in the press is he never actually insults anyone directly. He always does it indirectly. And one of the fantastic examples of where he's having a bit of a pop at Fleming is he talks about the cracking of thorns under a pot, which is a biblical reference, I believe, and it's essentially saying that he's foolish. Now, there's never an explanation given as to why he chose these passages to send through. You might infer that perhaps they're a warning for Fleming. So Henry V, that's from the night prior to the Battle of Agincourt, and the Merchant of Venice. So maybe saying, you know what happens if you come and get your pound of flesh. But Fleming is absolutely outraged by this. And this is where some of the most fantastic language comes into play. So he talks about dastardly attempts to jam us and ruffianly acts and that sort of stuff. And he has a decision to make. Does he go public with this? And yes, he does, because he wants to find out who did it. So he complains about scientific hooliganism. So he's put out the statement and wants to know who did it. And he'd find out in just a few days. So Fleming complains, obviously, of like monkeyish pranks and scientific hooliganism. He also makes intimations of violence towards Nevil, saying, yeah, things will be rough for them and stuff like that. And this argument goes across several different newspapers and journals and things like that. But during their exchanges, Nevil absolutely outclasses Fleming in the argument. And in an Edwardian mic drop moment, he ends with, "I must decline, sir, to prolong a discussion wherein I'm confronted with such a hopeless tangle of self-contradiction." That's my email signature. But Fleming was obviously, his reputation was destroyed by this. So he only had one thing left to do, which was resign. So Marconi and Fleming had been humiliated. Fleming was looking for another job. There's a nice little postscript to this. The America's Cup again. So Lee de Forest and Marconi battle it out again. And Sir Thomas Lipton, rather than taking on J.P. Morgan this time, he's taking on J.D. Rockefeller. J.P. Morgan and J.D. Rockefeller are the same boat club. I think it's the New York Yacht Club. But there's an imitator to Nevil. But it wasn't received quite as well. Now, the transmissions, this time they were protected. They used a tuning to try and stop people interfering with them. So this event would probably qualify as the first denial of service attack. And it's really unfortunate, but I couldn't actually find what the messages were, only that they're referred to as a spiteful extreme and floods of profanity and obscenity. Now, I understand these messages went on for days and completely ruined the transmission whatsoever. But that's kind of the story of the first wireless hack and the first wireless hacker. But there is a legacy to this as well. So Thomas Lipton. So he made a couple more attempts for the America's Cup. Any guesses on?
Shamrocks 3, 4, 5, 6.
Perfect. He stopped at 5. Well,
Solid name.
so
Solid.
yeah, he was described by the mayor of New York as possibly the world's worst yacht builder, but absolutely the world's most cheerful loser. So the Americans were quite endeared by his cheerful attitude and loss. And they presented him with a gold trophy for world's best loser in 1930. So John Ambrose Fleming. So he went on to invent the thermionic valve. And this invention made him the father of electronics. It's the first electrical component. And this component was really significant. So if you kind of spin onto World War II, it was this component that they used to make Colossus, which is pivotal in breaking Nazi messages during World War II. But also, and I found this a little bit sad actually, because he was rehired by the Marconi company in the same year, who then assumed a patent for the thermionic valve, so he never actually received a penny other than his salary for that. And he remained prolific in lecturing and education and that sort of stuff. So also kind of related to Colossus, he set the original syllabus for electronic engineers that Tommy Flowers would have studied, and he was still lecturing at the time, and his successor would have been the kind of main guy there at London University. And he was knighted in 1921 for his scientific contributions. So, what became of Nevil? So, after the 1903 hack, Lee de Forest, after the America's Cup, comes to England to demonstrate his wireless system. Now, Marconi had started patent litigation against him. But Nevil sells his patents to Lee de Forest and becomes his advisor and gets around the patent dispute. So he continues on as an advisor to Lee de Forest. Unfortunately, the Egyptian Hall was demolished in 1905, which is sad because I would have liked to have seen it. He becomes president of the Magic Circle and continues on, essentially running the family business after J.N. dies. Nevil himself died, and there's a story about his funeral, which I've been able to partially confirm. So the story goes, when they lowered his coffin into the ground, the skies turned black and lightning struck his gravestone. Now, there are reports from the newspapers on that day of an unexpected overcast period in a specific area of London. Doesn't say anything about the lightning, but seems quite interesting. But Marconi obviously went to sort of become the father of radio, and it was quite pivotal. I think someone mentioned Crippen, and his operators were on the Titanic and are credited for saving a lot of lives that day. But also he had a significant involvement during World War II as well, having quite key in some of the early developments of radar and using his infrastructure to provide radio equipment and training to wireless operators for World War I. His company effectively became a significant part of the Y service that was used for intercepting enemy communications during World War I, and then set the template for World War II. But he aggressively protected his technology, and he had secured a lot of important contracts and built up his infrastructure so early on that no one was ever going to catch him. But that's the story of the first wireless hack.
Absolutely terrific. Thank you so much. Now, I have a question before we throw it to the floor. The Maskelynes.
Yes.
Is this the family of sorcerers where one of them would go on to allegedly have an awful lot to do with camouflage, distraction techniques in the desert in World War II? There's a book published about 15 years ago that drew upon a lot of these things that one of their ancestors sold their soul to the devil, so for 7 generations they would be wizards, and then he... Please.
Yes, so...
Great, that's all that rolled up then.
So that would be Jasper Maskelyne.
That's the one, yes.
And that was the son of Neville. Now, a piece of guidance I was given very early on when I spoke to the Davenport collection, who inherited a lot of the Maskelyne records and things like that. How do I say this politely? Jasper didn't let bullshit get in the way of a good story. So he was known to exaggerate quite a lot. So you have to take everything he said with a pinch of salt, although The War Magician does make for a great story.
Yeah.
I think the story of Neville is far more interesting. The legacy of JN is just formidable.
What, the inventions alone are
Yeah.
much better than coming up with a different camouflage scheme based on what you find in Cairo to inventing typewriters and broadcasting machines.
Yeah, but the story of the deal made with the devil, so I think it was either 7 or 10 generations, and JN, Neville and Jasper were the last 3 generations of that. And JN also referred to it, so it's not just Jasper making stuff up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I found that quite interesting, and there were certain things that JN certainly lent into which added to the kind of mystique of the magician. So they also claim they were descendants of Nevil Maskelyne, the astronomer. Although that's no proof.
Yes, question over there?
Mine's sort of also slightly military interest, because it's all occurs that to certain players at the time Marconi was doing his work, the thought must have occurred that if he manages to make this work, suddenly warfare becomes an awful lot more difficult. Is there any suggestion that the Maskelynes were in some way engaged to deliberately sabotage or discredit Marconi's wireless system for any militaristic purposes?
Not for militaristic purposes, but the accusation was made against Maskelyne that he was sent there by the Eastern Telegraph Company to sabotage Marconi's work. So because he'd done that work earlier in 1902 in Porthcurno, when the event in 1903 happened, it was also asserted it was on the payroll for that, but that was for commercial interests. Now, interestingly, a little postscript to that is the Eastern Telegraph Company and Marconi Company later would merge and become cable and wireless.
I think that's a really interesting point, because obviously the development of the aeroplane was thought that would end war, because anyone could be hit at any particular time. And obviously development of radio, we can all talk to each other, that would end war. But, as it says in Fallout, I don't need to finish that statement. Question over here.
As I understand it, 1901 is the key date, because at that point the telegraph the cable was extended from Bombay to Australia, hence global telecommunications. But they were a British monopoly, so the key driver is the Nazis. I mean the Germans. And we got there. And because the only way of breaking the British monopoly would be for wireless telegraphy and a network of wireless telegraphy stations which encircled the globe. So they didn't make an appearance here, but in the background, the driver would be to break
Berlin to Baghdad Railway again.
Yeah,
breaking the British monopoly. Yeah.
I don't know if you broaden the story, they're bound to come in. But
Yeah. So, obviously, kind of Britain was the kind of communication hub of the world, right?
monopoly. Yeah.
And you saw that kind of play out at the start of World War I as well, where within the first couple of days they had dug up the German cables and severed them, so that forced them into using wireless. But there was a commercial reason why Marconi did the kind of work on the boats, because the GPO had a monopoly on communication within the UK as a sort of landmass, so the only commercial opportunity was transmitting out.
Excellent. Well, absolutely terrific. Thank you very much to our speakers tonight. Really brilliant stuff. Just a final house note. The curé, Michael Silver, many of you whom known, he's not in his current residence which you might have been seen on club communications earlier. If you would like to go and visit him, the visiting hours are now much broader now. He is in a hospice. You can get the details from the club. I saw him today. He is not a well man, obviously, but he's still got exactly the same attitude, exactly the same behaviour. And when I was there, he got acupuncture, people brought in cake. Basically, it's a first-class service that he's getting. But if you know the curator and would like to pop in, clubmen have made a terrific impact on the number of visitors he's had, as have the clergy, obviously. He's drowning in medals and bones of the Christ and things like that at the same time. Several of them have tried to convert him to Roman Catholicism at the same time. So he's very jolly, but I'm sure he'd appreciate anybody else dropping in at the same time. But one last round of applause for our absolutely terrific and fascinating